Hi, my name is Jaime Stief. I work at the Tamarack Institute. You're here for the webinar titled Learnings from a Canada-wide Youth Employment and Skills Program, the Dynamic Engaged Vital Lab. We'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. I'm joining from the traditional territories of the Neutral, Anishinaabe, and Haudenosaunee peoples, colonially known as Waterloo, Ontario. We share a land acknowledgement for a few reasons, one of them being that when we think about truth and reconciliation, we know that that work starts with truth, and acknowledging where you're coming from, the traditional stewards of the land, is an important first step to recognizing the treaties that govern the lands that you're on, because we're all treaty people. It's a first step, it's not a last step, but we like to start there. We encourage everybody who's here to share what territories they're joining from in the chat box. We also want to acknowledge those who came here as settlers and migrants, either in this generation or generations past, and those who came here involuntarily, particularly those brought to these lands as a result of the transatlantic slave trade and slavery. We pay tribute to those ancestors of African origin and descent, especially during Black Futures Month, but all year really. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Sav.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Jaime, for that intro and the acknowledgement. My name's Sav. I'm going to do a brief intro to myself and the speakers, and then a brief intro to the DevLab project before we get started with some of the questions and the content of this webinar. So my name's Sav. I'm a staff at Tamarack. I currently work on the community climate transitions and community building belonging teams. But before that, I was a staff member at CBYF, Communities Building Youth Futures, and I supported the DevLab project. So that's a little bit about me. I use she, her, and they, them pronouns, and I'm going to go in order of who I see in terms of our speakers. So we're joined by Sarah Armouch. She's the director of data at Youthful Cities. And so she's going to be sharing some stuff around the data outcomes and data tools that Youthful Cities has put together. There's Dan Alferov. If you can give us a wave, Dan. He's a data manager at Youthful Cities too. Aaliyah Lahai, who was a manager of cities for us during the CBYF project. She led the work out of Moncton. We have our past research assistant, Sahar Bahramali. If you can give us a wave, Sahar. Sahar is a high school student and community leader in Moncton who does a lot of great work, and she supported Aaliyah with the research and community engagement pieces. And last but certainly not least, we have Sylvia Cheuy from LC, who was one of the major leads on this project and really supported and uplifted the work, especially the in-person summits that we had in Moncton and Yellowknife, as well as the online data share back session that we had with Whitehorse. Yeah, so awesome to have you all here. So really quickly, let's talk about what is DevLab, what was it, and what kind of role did we all play in this project. So DevLab was a Canada-wide research project that was a partnership between Tamarack Institute and Youthful Cities. It was funded by ESDC. That was Education Skills Development Canada. So that's where we got our funding for this project. And this project looked at the current work ecosystem in 8 Canadian cities: Whitehorse, Yellowknife, Vancouver, Calgary, Regina, Toronto, Montreal, and Moncton. And so the goal was to look at what skills mismatches were there between youth and employer needs, kind of the skills that Canadian youth needed to get jobs and have successful careers in Canada, specifically post kind of the COVID-19 quarantine period. Yeah, and so the hope was that we would find some opportunities to support the youth workforce to become more dynamic, engaged, and vital through the data that we gathered. Yeah, and what we did was we put out a 20-question survey for youth to fill out in all 8 of these communities, and we also did qualitative interviews with a smaller sample of youth in each of these communities that our researchers and our community managers led. So that's how we collected the data that Sarah and Dan then went and analyzed. Yeah, so I can go on to the next slide. This is an example of some of the data that we shared back with youth in Moncton. So what we did in both Moncton and Yellowknife was to share back the data with the communities. We asked the Youthful Cities data team to kind of help us profile some data that we thought would be relevant for youth, adult allies, and service providers to look at and kind of look for barriers and opportunities for solutions around. And so this kind of tells folks who participated in Moncton compared to the Dev Lab overall, kind of what the demographic was, how many of them were in school, some demographics around if they were racialized, if what their housing situation was, and what their employment status was. Yeah, so this is just an example of one of the data kind of areas that we profiled for Moncton. Next slide, please. This is another great poster that Aaliyah and Sahar put together with the data that we chose to profile. So an example of some of the things that we shared with youth were kind of what were the trends for networking and job searching that youth in Moncton were experiencing. So we found out that 64% of Moncton youth felt comfortable networking, which was 26% above the DevLab overall average, which was something that the youth responded to. That's interesting, you know. Another thing was that 40% of Moncton youth reported that they picked up networking skills from in-person job support resources like career centers, maybe kind of resources that they already had in their current jobs or school systems. And then we also profiled kind of some of the comments that youth made in the interviews as well to kind of give folks a holistic look at this kind of youth data piece. Yeah, next one. Awesome. So there's Sahar. So this is kind of like a snapshot into the data lab that we did. We put these posters with different data pieces all over a room, and we had a great group of youth who joined from different school districts, different programs, as well as some adult allies, some service providers kind of come together, look at the data, and share their feedback about it. And so Sahar is looking really excited about networking and job search here. Yeah. We can go to the next slide, Jaime. And so at the end of this data walk, what we asked was for folks to kind of conglomerate in different groups and kind of look for solutions or look for opportunities around these data pieces. And so one opportunity that youth and kind of some adult allies came up with was starting a kind of this collective group that would provide youth with entrepreneurship opportunities through job fairs, education, information, financial planning, kind of lead them to different courses that would help them build skills for employment and job searching, kind of like a one-stop shop. Because folks reported that all these skills that they wanted to build were in different areas, but there wasn't a space that they could access them at the same time. So that was a really great kind of solution that folks came up with together, and they made this awesome poster. Yeah. And so can we go back? Sorry, Jaime, thank you. So what the outcome of this summit was that we had some microgrant money to give to an organization that would take on this solution and kind of lead a pilot out on it. And so this ended up being the winning kind of solution that folks came up with. And then there's the Idea Center, which is an awesome entrepreneurship program that's run through the Anglophone School District in Moncton, kind of self-volunteered to host this idea, and they were provided with the microgrant. So this is kind of taking root now in Moncton. So it's really exciting. We can go to the next slide. Thanks, Jaime. Alternatively, this is from our Yellowknife community that we supported. We wanted to take an approach that was kind of more relative to what the youth and community service providers in the area had been noticing. And so we were working closely with two groups. One of them was the Tree of Peace Friendship Center in Yellowknife, and the other was Home Base. And there's a large Dene population of youth that access both of these partners. And so Sylvia noticed that, you know, there's already a skills recognition booklet that our partners had shared with us, not dissimilar from the DevLab Skills for Success that were shared with us through ESDC. And so we wanted to see what's the overlap between what our partners are already highlighting in their community and what we're kind of putting forward through this research project. And so this is just an example of kind of the two things that we were looking at putting together to make it more relevant to the community. Yeah, we can go to the next one. And this is a sample of data that we profiled in the data walk for this particular community. So we noticed that youth in Yellowknife believe their city is performing 14% better in Indigenous culture and truth and reconciliation than the DevLab average. That told us that this is something that's really important to this community. And we really made sure to try and spotlight the Dene values that the Truth, Peace, Friendship Center was sharing with us, that kind of community folks are putting forward. And so this is an example of kind of one of the slides that we had put around in the room. We can go to the next one. This is another one kind of similar to the one in Moncton that Sarah and Dan profiled for us, job search and employment. So Yellowknife youth reported that they attended less in-person job fairs and they got more of their career advice from friends and family. So networking kind of took more informal routes than formal routes, and that was interesting for service providers and youth themselves to see where is an opportunity to get youth more in touch with different skills and different employment paths. Yeah, so we can go to the next slide. And so we kind of did the same thing, one day with adult allies and service providers, and the next day with youth themselves. And they came up with, this is an example of one of the ideas that they came up with. It was kind of like similar to the other idea, but focused on a financial literacy program to get youth kind of hands-on skills of how they can improve their employment skills and find kind of more opportunities to learn about different employment opportunities that are out there. Yeah, we can go to the next slide. This is our lovely group of adult allies that came together and service providers who came up with this idea after looking at all of the data and brainstorming together. Really awesome group of people. And then the next day on the next slide, Sylvia and I took this to the youth at the Home Base Center, and they gave us feedback on how to make this, or well, they gave the youth service providers and adult allies feedback on how to make this idea better and more relevant to them. And then similarly to Moncton, the microgrant was given to this kind of table group of different service providers, and it was led by Evergood Medicine, which is a community kind of organization that supports youth with connecting with land and culture, but then also other opportunities to gain life skills. Yeah. We can, I think that is the last slide for me. I'm going to pass it on to Sarah to give an intro to kind of the Youthful Cities outcomes before we start our discussion.
Thank you. Thank you, Sav, for this introduction. I hope everyone can see my screen. I'm Sarah Armouch, and I'm joining from the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka people and Mohawk Nation, also known as Montréal. And today I'm going to be walking you through one of the key outputs that came out of the DevLab project. So as Sav mentioned, there was a big research component to this project, and it was funded by Employment and Social Development Canada through the means of the Skills for Success program, because they were very much interested in learning like what has changed post-pandemic in terms of workforce development requirements, in terms of the work ecosystems, and trying to assess how the Skills for Success framework, which you can find on their website, actually relates to current needs and aspirations of young people, but also how does it match with the expectations of employers. And as part of the DevLab outputs, we know that there was a big issue with data on how we actually present it back, because we have different data systems that exist within Canada. And so we wanted to see how can we turn this data that we've been collecting through different research tools, which I'll talk about in a minute, into something that is accessible, engaging, and that anyone can actually use in their line of work. So whether you're a policymaker thinking of policies that are related to young people, whether you're a youth serving organization that's thinking about like future programming and wants to have a better understanding of youth needs, or whether you're just an interested individual or a young person yourself and you wanted to see what's happening, like what's the current state of young people in Canada and what is the data actually telling us. So the output that we create is an open data portal that we call the Youth Data Lab, or in French, Labo Data Jeunesse. And this is a portal that is openly accessible to everyone, and you'll have access to the link. Jaime will share it in the chat, that allows you to engage with the data that has been collected from the DevLab project, and we turned it into data, insight, and stories so that you can have a better idea of what's been happening. So if you go to the website and you go to Insights, you'll have different boxes, and each one of them actually refers to results that were collected through different research tools. So we have quantitative research tools and qualitative. So quantitative, we're talking about a survey, a national survey that was launched in the end of 2023 up till spring of 2024. And we had a total of 1,626 young people from across Canada respond to this survey, and coming from different demographic backgrounds, having different lived experiences. And now I'm just going to show you some of the data insights and how it's been presented. So just to give you an idea of how you could actually use this data for your own work. So this is the survey results. We kind of compiled them into different thematic areas based on the analysis we conducted. And I just wanted to mention that myself and Dan are today present in this call, but there's a bigger team that was behind the DevLab project from Youthful Cities. So I do want to acknowledge their efforts and time that were invested in this project. So the core themes that came out of our research were related to, first of all, like thinking about the transition from education to work. Second of all, talking about like post-pandemic work ecosystem. Third of all, thinking about what is an ideal organization from the perspective of young people. And finally, paving the way for the future of work in cities, because a lot of this work was focused on cities. So we focused on 8 different cities that Sav mentioned. And now I'm just going to show you on a national level some of the patterns that we picked up. And then we're still working, this is work in progress, to kind of develop this platform to have more detailed segmentation and kind of looking into different demographics related to gender, to age, to ethno-racial identity. So if you go to this section of the website, you will have these bar charts that actually show you what is happening in terms of skills development, for example, for young people. So we were looking at, let's say I go to this theme, which is paving the way for a future of worker cities. We had asked young people, what is the most important characteristic of success for you? Because part of our analysis was looking at what is actually success when we talk about skills for success. And we noticed from this at first kind of analysis that for a big part of the young people, like for the majority of them, it was really looking into having healthy relationship with their families, friends, and community circles. So this talks a bit about like having community support and having like that really good anchoring within your community. But directly after it, like we have 71% of young people who said that directly after it comes financial stability and freedom, which kind of is something that we picked up from the analysis. Is in addition to kind of looking into skills development and workforce development, we realized that affordability was a big issue for young people, specifically with emphasis on housing. And I'll show you some of that data in a minute, which kind of prompt us into doing another survey to look more closely into housing, for example. So this is just like, I'm not going too much into the data insights themselves because there's a lot of data, and we will have a dedicated webinars in the future to go more into those insights. But just to show you how this tool can present data in a more accessible and engaging manner and kind of unified manner, because we're looking across Canada. So this is one of the themes that we looked at. If I look more into envisioning an ideal organization, so you can actually pick whichever question you would like from the survey. So let's say, what makes an organization the least attractive for young people to work for? So if we look at the results, we see like there's a range of things. But for example, 60% of them said long hours and unreasonable expectations. We have 60% that talk about bullying or harassment from colleagues or supervisors. 63% talk about poor leadership. So all of these are kind of recommendations for employers and organizations to revisit their policies and to revisit what kind of environments they're creating for young people. Some of the things we notice, it's not about young people not wanting, let's say, to work for certain organization because they don't want to, but because it depends on the culture of this organization. So thinking also about the value proposition of that organization. And I'll show you some of the more qualitative data around that. But again, 58% also talked about poor communication, A lot of them talked about long working hours. So all of this kind of gives you a hint about what type of organizations young people are looking to work for. And so you can keep going across different themes and kind of pick whichever question you're interested in. So let's say if we're thinking what kind of skills young people are confident they have, for example, you can have a look and then you notice that they have less confidence in financial skills, which is something that came up in the Moncton Summit, for example, where they wanted to do something around financial literacy. They were less confident about their ability to be in a leadership position. Some of them were less confident in being able to create equity, diversity, inclusion, resources for their companies. So that gives us also some of the kind of implications on what are the skills that young people actually need to acquire in order to be able to navigate the current ecosystem. And part of the results that we picked up on is that 56% of young people that were surveyed reported a skills mismatch. So between the skills they are confident they have versus what are the skills expected from the employers. So that's also something for employers to consider, is like, and educational institutions, like, why is this mismatch happening? Which actually in turn leads to thinking about opportunities for young people to acquire those skills, particularly that for a lot of them, they missed out on these in-person engagement because of the pandemic. So talking about networking opportunities, talking about co-ops, etc. So this is just one of the tools that you can access through YDL, which shows you more like survey results. And you can actually customize those charts by picking the options that you want to see. In addition to that, you can dig deeper into the data because we kind of try to do like psychographic clustering and segmentation of the young people we engage in this research. And so we had 3 different groups, and we kind of looked at them based on how they rated different elements when they were looking at their cities. So one group is very much focused on economic development, and they had affordability as a very big priority, and they thought that affordability was a very big issue in their cities. The second cluster of young people were those that were still forming their opinions. So, and a lot of those young people were actually newcomer and immigrant youth. So they still don't really know how they think about these different elements within their cities. And the third category is also young people that are more inclined towards social issues and social good. So they also had affordability as a very big priority, but afterwards they had mental health and climate. So these are some of the psychographic clusters we created. And obviously I'm not going too much into details, but if you go to the website, you can actually explore deeper how those young people formed these different clusters and how they thought about different kind of topics and how they responded to the survey, depending on which group they belong to. So this is one of the research tool called Youth Chart that shows you all the results from our survey, which you can kind of navigate. And we're still kind of adding more of the data there and data segments. Another tool, which is more related to the qualitative interviews. So we had over 300 conversations with young people and industry leaders, employers, people who work in the youth sector. And then we were able to kind of categorize those into different kind of thematic areas. And you can actually check for each of the 8 cities how responses differed. But on a national level, these are like the core themes that came out. Thinking about ideal organization, thinking about that transition to work, talking about like the post-pandemic ecosystems, the future of work. And then within each one of those, there are like sub-themes. So young people talked about mentorship and growth opportunities, gaps in support system, thinking about social accountability, talking about AI, talking about providing wraparound support systems, talking about the barriers they face, intergenerational differences, and a lot of different kind of things that you can explore into this data set. And so if you press on any of the nodes, you can actually see the quotes directly from the young people themselves or the youth allies or professionals or employers, and you can kind of go through them and kind of pick up whatever is relevant to your work. So that's another tool called Youth Site, which is really engaging with more qualitative research. The third thing I wanted to show you is the Urban Work Index, which is also something that we did and that informed a lot of the community events and summits that were shared. Is we usually look at different cities and their performance across 10 different areas. Those would include like skills and education, EDIJR, thinking about health services, thinking about infrastructure and transportation, digital transformation. And we do like a ranking for the 30 major cities in Canada, trying to see what's the best city for young people to work in. And so if you go into that, you'll find a map that shows you like the rankings and what were positive kind of things for that city and what are areas for improvement. So Toronto was ranked #1. And there's a reasoning behind that. But however, Toronto was ranked 29 out of 30 when it comes to affordability, because young people spend more than 30% of their income, for example, on housing. So if you look at that map, you will find all the different cities in a visual manner, and you can just click on any dot and it will show you the ranking along with an explanation on performance. And then if you scroll down, trying just to scroll down from this map, you'll also see a heat map for the 30 cities. So for example, if we're talking about Yellowknife that was mentioned, we realized that Yellowknife was ranked number 30 because of different kind of issues across those different categories. However, Yellowknife was number 3 when it comes to transportation, but it had a big issue when it comes to the city economy for young people. It had a big issue when it comes to good youth jobs, so jobs that young people perceive to have a proper work-life balance that has really good benefits. It doesn't do very well when it comes to entrepreneurship. So that's one example. Right above it is Moncton. Although young people are really engaged and they actually thought that their cities were doing even better than they expected, when they looked at the data, they found out that there was something that was not really working in their cities. And Aaliyah and Sahar will talk more about that. But this is another kind of visualization of the data that kind of gives you an idea of what's happening on a city level. But we can also extrapolate on a provincial level and kind of use that to really push for policy change, for more targeted programs, and have better funding. The last tool that I wanted to show you that is also something super engaging and makes data access really easy is a chatbot that was created for this project. And the difference is that it really operates like ChatGPT. It was powered by ChatGPT, but the difference is that you actually know where the data is coming from. So it's not like a very random kind of data that ChatGPT is pulling. We actually have specific databases that you can select and kind of ask questions and get specific answers. So we have interviews that we collected for the DevLab project. We have interviews that were collected during COVID for another project. We have Reddit opinions. We have a collection of articles that were compiled for this project. So let's say I want to select the DevLab interviews and I have a question. So what are the skills youth need for the future of work? And I just kind of put it in. It will actually generate response for you. And it works both in English and French. So you can select whichever, it's bilingual. And it gives you a clear answer about what were the responses for young people overall from the interviews. If you go to the YC curated, which is like something that is a specific selection of articles that were collected, and like we look at what are the top 3 skills youth perceive to be important. If I enter this, it will actually tell me the 3 skills. So we have critical thinking, like problem solving, communication, and ability to collaborate in teams. And if you notice, there's a reference at the bottom. So if you take that reference and you just input it on the side, like where it says put the document number, it will actually pull for you the source document. So you can actually look at it, know what article this is coming from. And then you can put this toggle on and it allows you to chat directly with that specific article. So all of this is really to simplify access to data and making data more accessible through data insights and making it really engaging. So whenever you want to write a report, a policy brief, or you just want to know what's happening, you can use the chatbot. You can look at more quantitative and numbers, support it with some quotes. So it's kind of a complementary tool that gives you all the pieces of the puzzle. And we have different data sets. So we have things around housing. We're still working on things related to affordability. And they have different features, different functions. And then you can even go and find, for example, if I go into the housing stuff really quick, because I know where we're on time. For example, you can even find data stories. So we turn a lot of this data into stories because we felt there's a need for people to have a better understanding of data. And often we don't know where to find that data because systems don't necessarily talk to each other, or it's really hard to standardize the data that we find, especially when it came to the index, for example. Some provinces had certain data, others did not have this data. Some of it was really old. We wanted to make sure it's recent. We wanted to make sure it's relevant. So there's a really rigorous process behind this, and we're trying as much as possible to facilitate the work for other organizations to take this data and use it for their own work. And you can even provide, like in the future of this platform, and Dan's gonna talk more about that, but in the future, you will be able to provide your own raw data, and we can help you in turning it into insights and visualizations so we can build stories together. So this is just a quick kind of summary of the data insights that came out of the Dev Lab, how we're presenting it. And this is one of the tools that can be purposed for different topics related to young people. And I'm gonna stop at that because I know I talked a lot about this platform, but I really encourage you to go try it out. We're still kind of like improving on it. So if you have any feedback, there's a survey integrated to leave us your feedback on how you might want to use this or what things we can improve. If you have follow-up questions, feel free to email us directly and we can talk more about this platform and the different data insights that we have on it. So thank you very much, and I'm gonna pass it back to you, Sav. I'll quickly stop sharing as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, for sharing the Youth Data Lab. It's really important to kind of be able to interact with data in an accessible and interesting way, especially for folks who aren't kind of data minded in the same way that somebody who does data for work on a regular basis, like you or Dan might be. And yeah, I just want to echo Sarah that please go check it out. It's so cool. It's been super useful for me as I kind of continue my work in other realms, especially looking at housing, kind of what youth are saying about employment and things like that. Yeah, so now I guess we're going to move into the panel discussion portion of the webinar. And I'm so excited to hear from our lovely panelists. And the first question I have for you folks is, could you please introduce yourselves and share a little bit about the work that you've done in relation to the DevLab project? If you could tie it back to community engaged research and youth futures in Canada, that would be great. I'm gonna pass it maybe to Aaliyah to start with this question, if that's cool. We can go from there.
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Sav. First, yeah, my name is Aaliyah, as Sav shared. I do want to share that Sahar and I are joining from Mi'kmaq, the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Mi'kmaq people. And these lands are covered by the treaties of peace and friendship. And I served as the research and outreach lead for the Dev Lab project. So my role involved really not only leading and coordinating the research that was conducted in Moncton, but also ensuring that the process was deeply rooted in equitable community engagement principles. So our focus was really on amplifying diverse youth voices and ensuring that their lived experience was shaped in the findings and our recommendations as well.
Awesome. And I think as somebody who attended the Moncton Summit that you planned, that was also reflected in the group of youth who showed up and felt comfortable because of the relationships that you had built with community alongside Sahar. And I guess that's a natural segue to Sahar. If you could kind of share your role in the work that you did, that would be awesome.
So, hi everyone, my name is Sahar, and well, as Saab mentioned, I'm a grade 12 student, and I was a research and outreach assistant for the DevLab project. And my role extended beyond the research. Yes, we did a lot of research, but it was mostly like fostering a good relationship with my community. We did many interviews, and like we talked about our project during the shareback sessions, and it was really amazing, and I really liked it. Through this, I also saw firsthand how a lack of confidence was built in the youth, because of the COVID that happened. And it was really interesting to see how the youth were tackling it. And their lab reinforced the research and helped me realize what's going on. And it was really nice to listen and advocate about youth voices and try to amplify their voices, as Aldia mentioned, and making youth heard during their life.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sahar. Yeah, it was really awesome because a lot of your kind of classmates also attended the event, and I could just see how much kind of, yeah, just what a unique perspective that having you as a part of our research team kind of brought to the project and really deepened kind of the outcomes that we were able to achieve at the community level. I think, Dan, if we could hear from you next, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sav, and thank you to everyone else for introducing themselves. My name is Dan, and I'm a research and innovation manager for Youthful Cities, and so I have the privilege of living and working on the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit as well, First Nation, colonially known as Toronto. And as far as my involvement in the project goes, I have had the pleasure of working with all of these lovely colleagues in varying capacities. But as far as my role was more focused on the design of the research and the YDL platform that Sarah shared with you recently. So really looking at from the data side of things and this concept of open data, how do we make the stories accessible to communities? How do we engage communities in the whole process, not just in the design of the various tools that we've kind of showcased for you, but also in terms of making themselves seen within the narratives and giving them the capacity to build their own narratives as well is something that I'm really proud of and I'm interested in. And so this project, or the DevLab project, was a great way to kind of build my own capacity for how to expand that to a broader scale on a national level and how to use technology to kind of facilitate some of that in a meaningful way. And so I'm excited to join all of you here today.
Awesome. Thanks, Dan. Yeah, your perspective was super helpful, especially to Sylvia, Aaliyah, and I, as we kind of tried to organize the data for the shareback sessions in a way that would be meaningful and accessible. And of course, last but not least, Sylvia, if you could kind of speak to this piece as well, I would appreciate it.
I was just typing in the chat. I think for me, reflecting on Moncton in particular, Sahar and Aaliyah really, the way they did the work was really important. They had a design team of youth who looked at all the data that was coming back and were trying to decide, like, what's the most important data to share back with adult allies and other youth. So that we can actually both make sense of it together and what really matters. But then more importantly, that kind of set the stage beautifully for some really good creative conversations about, so now what? Like, what do we want to do together? What priorities? And you saw that beautiful visual that they created. What really matters to us? Because it's one thing to see what's going on, but the real freedom, I think, and power comes from coming together and saying, so what do we want to do about it? And that's part of, I think, what I loved most about the design.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sylvia. And Sylvia brought a really great kind of tool to the in-person sessions, which was this data shareback piece through the data walk. And I would encourage folks to kind of look up what a data walk is. I know Tamarack has some resources, but it really kind of changed the way that we were able to share data and get community engaged. I'm going to move on to the next question. So what were the biggest challenges that you faced in the data collection process? And what insights did these give you into the community engaged research process overall? I think maybe I'd ask Dan to start this time, if that's cool.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sav. So I think I can speak a bit towards more of like the national scope that we dealt with in Youthful Cities. And I think the top challenge when you're talking about collecting data that is representative of community needs is the awareness, access, and sovereignty of data. So in a country that's kind of as dispersed and diverse as Canada, we sort of lack a standardized form of governance and reporting on different topics that Sarah kind of touched on when she mentioned the index first and foremost. So things like climate action, things like Indigenous culture, truth and reconciliation, creating kind of data standards around these things is something that hasn't really been done as of yet. And so that was a really big challenge because to collect the data, we actually worked with youth in all of those communities and tried to define what some of these standards might look like from the youth perspective. And what we ran into has been kind of highlighted throughout the presentations you've seen earlier with different understandings of skills for success, community to community, different understandings of what a good youth job may look like in a community versus another community, even different standards for health and wellness, community to community. So I think one of the things that, one of the insights that that leads to is really this need to choose some of these measures as a broader collective and understand how we can find some points of intersection between these community needs so that we can actually evaluate some of the programs that are put into place to tackle these broader challenges. And so just want to reiterate with kind of a shared understanding of sovereignty. So if you're looking to learn more about data sovereignty practices or how you can create that ownership over community data on a broader scale, I would recommend this link here, and this is the First Nations Information Center library for data sovereignty. And what they look to emphasize with kind of these principles is really ensuring that the community has ownership over their data and that this ownership is sort of end to end. So in the research design process, what kind of questions are you asking? How are you evaluating the impacts of some of these projects down to the narratives that you're forming based on the data? So keeping communities involved in kind of that whole process and really turning it into a positive cycle, I think is really important. And kind of for future projects, one of the things that we should take away and I feel we should emphasize as a collective here is making sure that different communities may have different needs. So how do we emphasize those within the data that we're using as critical metrics or keystone metrics for some of these things? And then how do we amplify their voices by also coming together across different communities and saying, these are maybe some of the shared needs, these are some of the needs that are unique, and this is how we can then design programming. So I think going back to it is centering it in community, but bringing in as many allies and kind of forming these collaboratives to tackle these issues in a meaningful way.
Awesome, Dan. Thank you so much for that answer and for the resource. I think I'm going to pose this question just to Aaliyah next before moving on to the next one in interest of time. So Aaliyah, if you have anything to kind of add from the Moncton perspective, I would love to hear that, and I'm sure the group would as well.
Yeah, so very in line with what Dan shared, one of the biggest challenges I think on the ground in Moncton as well, and conducting research in general, is navigating the colonially entrenched data process, and that creates barriers for meaningful engagement. Traditional research methods, they often prioritize numbers over lived experience and various other nuances, so it can be a bit difficult to capture the realities of marginalized communities as well. And so ultimately, same thing on the ground here in Moncton, it really reinforced the need for community-centered approaches that value relationships, local knowledge, and culturally relevant methods. I will say in line with that too, time constraints, especially with grant-funded projects, that's another challenge. Strict deadlines can often make engagement feel rushed and transactional rather than authentic. And so building real relationships, it takes time and it takes a safe space as well. And if those things don't often neatly fit into project timelines. So that's another thing, another consideration. But to address this, we were able to partner with local organizations to keep our work grounded and rooted in community. But yes, engagement, it requires long-term commitment beyond a single project. And so those are some of the key themes that we saw were emerging. Specifically for Moncton, resource limitations was another major obstacle in a small city like ours. Many of the challenges that we were researching that youth were facing, we were facing as well while conducting the research, and they served as barriers in the process. Sometimes organizations operate in silos in New Brunswick and specifically in Moncton, so it was a bit difficult to find up-to-date information and to connect those systems together. So in some cases, existing data lacked some of that nuance and left gaps in finding on where other organizations collaborated or didn't on certain aspects. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks so much, Aaliyah, especially kind of I'm taking away the role in relationship building as getting the most out of kind of the community engaged data process being really important. I think Dan kind of touched on that from a more national scale, but I can see how that's definitely important at the city level. The next question is, can you share how you engaged youth and different community actors in the data collection and share back process? It would be great if you could touch on some of the challenges and successes you faced. I think if Sylvia could kind of speak to this first, that would be great. Maybe thinking of the work that we did in Yellowknife and Whitehorse, trying to get those shareback sessions off the ground.
Yeah, I think I added something to the chat around data walks. I think working with the hosts, right? Whoever those hosts are, because we had such a beautiful wealth of data from Sarah and Dan. So it was really about thinking what matters most to the community. What is it that they're most interested and energized to kind of dig into, or how does it line up with other things that they're doing? And we really worked with them to sort of zero in of all the data points. What are the most important ones to bring forward that really resonate and align? I think it was lovely because we used a method that we could use either in person or we could do virtually. I think that was really important because we ended up doing a virtual version in Whitehorse. But as a concrete example, I mean, they had a territorial youth strategy. And so that was really helpful. And then the data that we really worked with and profiled, we made sure kind of aligned and reflected some of the priorities that as a territory they had already identified. So, but the objective is really about bringing it down to a level where everyone's kind of seeing it together. They have some time and space to talk about it with each other, and then have an opportunity to really think about. I think that the so now what piece is a really, really important piece, because too often people, particularly youth, are asked to give in their data and information, but not always having an opportunity to learn what happens with the data that they've given. And even further beyond that, even knowing about, okay, what is this data saying? Having a chance to actually work together with others to come up with responses for it, I think is really, really important.
Yeah, thanks so much, Sylvia. And I just also, on the topic of Whitehorse, one of our colleagues, Marie Stewart, kind of was leading out the work in Whitehorse and really supported with the planning process and made a lot of the posters too. And so they kind of worked out of Whitehorse, kind of using the same principles that Sylvia talked about. In interest of time, I am going to move on to the next question. And so I'm wondering, how would you folks say that your understanding of community engaged research has been deepened or changed by this project? And I'm wondering if you can start us off, Dan.
Yeah, and I'll just be brief here because I think Sylvia and Aaliyah have touched on great points about bringing the narratives back to community and helping them understand the kind of so what of it. I'd just like to make a quick extension that I think, in terms of my own understanding of community action research, an important thing is once you've kind of established that so what and you have some sort of direction to work towards, whether that's a policy or programming or, you know, an initiative that you can create action around, I think it's also important to include the community and the collectives that you're working with in terms of defining what are the critical outcomes from that programming. And I think that's a piece that oftentimes is very prescriptive in spaces. It's either tied to, you know, number of youth engaged or kind of the monetary value of a program. And I think it's always important to also stay grounded in how the needs of the community are reflected in those metrics. And so that's something that I'll be taking away for future work is how do we continue to work with community in a cyclical process which facilitates those relationships and meaningful impact.
Yeah, thanks so much, Dan. I'm wondering, Sahar, if you have anything to add too, because I know this was kind of your first experience working on a data project like this, and I'd love to hear about what you learned, what you took away.
Well, as for me, the DevLab project deepened my understanding of community engaged research a lot because, as for me, didn't have a lot of experience as for research, as you also like mentioned. It was pretty much my first time, and I thought that maybe like research was mostly like in a scientific part and not in like social events or anything. And it was really interesting to have learned about like things like that in the DevLab project. So I really enjoyed it, and also like I really enjoyed the collaboration that I had like with Aaliyah. I learned a lot about from Aaliyah and like how to work really well, and like especially in Canva because my Canva it wasn't that well, and after that I learned a lot of skills from her. So it was really amazing, and also like working with you and Sylvia, uh, i I really enjoyed it, even though like we weren't really close and it was like remote, but I really enjoyed it. And thank you so much for the opportunity. It was great, and I would do it again if I had the chance. Thank you.
Awesome, Sahar. I would do it again with you too. You're awesome. You're such a star, and you brought such a great youth perspective. I'm just wondering, before I move on to the final question that I want everyone to answer, Aaliyah, if you kind of want to add on to anything that Sahar said.
No, I think Sahar summarized it really well. One thing that we did talk about is how, you know, community is not static. It's constantly evolving, shifting. And so, in terms of our methodology and how we approach community, we must do so with that level of flexibility as well. But we operate in a gray area where we're bumping up against institutions and structures that are quite rigid and bureaucratic too. So what we found, I often told Sahara, you know, it's like we have a magnifying glass and we're looking in these various cracks, and you see meshes of organizations and community projects that serve to hold our city together that are not often spoken about or mentioned. So it was quite interesting to see, and even when communicating with, you know, policymakers and city officials, bringing that to the forefront as well with diverse youth voices.
Yeah, thank you so much. You guys were a real star duo. I think for most of the research project, it was really hard to kind of get the data collected in a timely fashion with all the barriers we were facing. But Aaliyah and Sahar always found a way in Moncton, and they kind of went above and beyond. And I think it just speaks to how savvy you folks are, but also the way that you prioritize community and relationship, which really kind of got us the data pieces that we needed. And so the final question that I want everyone to answer before I end this lovely session is, could you please share a personal highlight or outcome of this project that you are most proud of and or excited by? I'm going to start with Sylvia, if you could answer that question.
Ooh, I knew you'd give it to me first. I think for me, one of the things I enjoyed the most was seeing the variety across the different communities. And I think a second highlight was when the local MP and minister came to the Moncton Summit, and she and her team spent virtually the entire time there, helping to sort of learn and flesh out ideas. And that really gave me a lot of hope.
Yeah, that was really great to see. And kudos to Aaliyah and Sahar for making that happen. Yeah, maybe I'll do Dan next, and then we can end off with Aaliyah and Sahar.
Yeah, thank you. I just want to share too, because I think we've all kind of been singing the praises of people doing the groundwork in terms of Aaliyah and Sahar on this call. But I think that, yeah, one of my highlights was the capacity of young people actually who participated in the data collection process to get that data, because it was not easy. It's not standardized. It's not easy to do a national scale project like that with the time constraints Aaliyah mentioned, but also the resource challenges that young people feel. So hats off to that. I would also like to share my personal highlight, which would be the YDL platform and how it's evolving. So what Sarah kind of shared earlier in the conversation. And I think what's next for the platform and what we want to see is really exciting. We really want to build capacity across different scales of organizations of being able to boost their own data and research, because one of the challenges in the data space is actually that capacity to collect data and to kind of reinforce, grant applications with meaningful statistics and kind of elevate that data capacity of your organization when you are dealing with resource constraints. And so we really want YDL to be an open, community-driven space where people can reference the breadth of knowledge that Youthful Cities and Tamarack have put together throughout the context of the DevLab project, but also in the broader context of Youthful Cities as an organization, as well as others that want to share their data there. So I really encourage everyone to kind of explore that platform and to ask questions and to not hesitate to look for collaborative opportunities.
Thanks so much, Dan. Yeah, Aaliyah and Sahar.
Yeah, I think as Moncton youth ourselves, it was quite inspiring to see the energy and the drive of the youth to engage in the project and their continued engagement even after the project. There is somewhat of a reoccurring theme in Moncton that we found where youth are only consulted after decisions have been made and after the fact. And then once again, given limited guidelines that they have to work with. So this project was really one of the first times that they worked directly with the raw data, conducted community asset mappings and system mapping, and drafted solutions based on those lived experience and outcomes of the research. And many of them followed the project's journey from inception to not even, I can't say close because it's still ongoing, and we see the outcomes of those projects and ideas that they created in that session. And so attending the shareback sessions and the career fairs and staying engaged with youth, we certainly did see something take root in the city. And it's like I always say I can smell it in the air where now communities, community organizations and projects are much more willing to bring youth into the discussion and inform them of what's happening rather than, only bringing something when it's completed.
Yeah, I agree. And I like that there's something in the air in Moncton now that you and Sahar have kind of put this great work of getting people together around this data out there. Sahar, do you have anything to say to end us off about your personal highlights and what you've taken away from this project?
Well, I'd say for me, the personal highlight was the summit because, we had this group of young people, David and Gabriella, that helped us in making the summit happen. And it was really amazing to see it come together at the end. And we had such a great time together. We learned about each other a lot. And I really liked seeing the youth that came to the summit engage with each other, talk about the problems in Moncton, and trying to find solutions to the problems. It was really interesting. And also, one of the other highlight was like seeing the MP, our local MP, Jeanette Petit-Pateler, to be there and also like talk with the youth. And like youth were really like open. They wanted to have their voice heard, and they talked about what were the problems in Moncton and what they wanted to see being fixed in Moncton. It was really great. And I really enjoyed it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. Yeah, that was such a great kind of answer to end us off. Thank you all for being here. I'm so excited to see kind of how the work grows with the YDL and kind of the upcoming stuff Youthful Cities is doing, and also the kind of micro grant projects that have taken root in Yellowknife and Moncton. But yeah, hats off to everybody here for this work, and thanks to everybody for attending the webinar. Yeah, thank you so much.